right. Well, good afternoon or good evening, wherever this finds you. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm excited to welcome you here to this timely webinar with SPP Professor Dr. Jim Coyle about his latest book, Tbilisi and the Bear. Before we get into the formal part of our program. I know almost all of you know Dr. Coyle quite well, but at least to give a little bit of his background, we are going to be speaking today about Dr. Coyle's new book, Tbilisi and the Bear, The Rise of Russian Influence in the Republic of Georgia. As mentioned, he has been a adjunct faculty with the School of Public Policy for a number of years, beloved as a teacher often of our foreign affairs, international relations capstone, as well as a number of other classes. Dr. Coyle has served in a number of positions, both in the federal government and in academia, including at the U.S. Army War College. He was the first Secretary for Political Military Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, senior political analyst for Palestinian affairs, and special assistant to the FBI New York City Joint Terrorism Task Force. He's the author of several books, including Culture and Conflict in the Middle East, published in December of 2003, and also the author of Russia's Interventions in Ethnic Conflicts, the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan. We'll be touching certainly on that theme in this conversation, as well as his recent book, preceding book before the one we'll talk about today, Russia's Border Wars and Frozen Conflicts. Professor Coyle speaks and or reads a number of languages, including Turkish, Persian, French, and German, and his areas of expertise are in national security strategy, Middle East politics, intelligence, comparative politics, IR, American politics, and European and Eurasian politics. Dr. Coyle received his bachelor's in foreign service at Georgetown and his master's in public administration from Temple in Philly, and his PhD in political science from George Washington University. And with that, I will bring you into the screen. And Dr. Coyle, it's great to have you here to talk about your latest book. And so before our conversation, I was hoping you could kind of set the table for our conversation today.
Well, sure. Thank you, Dean Peterson, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I hope nobody will try to question me on my languages because they're a bit rusty at this point, but that's another story. If you haven't read the book, to those of you that are out there, I encourage you to do it. Russia's Border War, Tbilisi and the Bear. You can get it at www.mazda Publishers, MAZDA Publishers, all one word, .com. And if you mention MESA 25 in the code, you'll get a 30% discount. And I would also add, this is not a paid advertisement because I get absolutely no profit from any book sales. But I've been working on this for a long time, so I'd like everybody to read it if they could. So the way this was set up was, is Ukraine the new Georgia? I would have to say yes. And why? Because there would have been no Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 if there had not been a lack of response from the West in 2014. There would have been no Russian invasion in 2014 if there had not been a lack of response to the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. And finally, there would have been no Russian invasion in 2008 if the world had not given its approval for Russian intervention in Georgia in 1993. Why is Russia doing this? Why is Russia involved? What's their goal? Quite simply, it's the restoration of the security border of the former USSR. The security border. I mean, they don't care anymore like they used to in the old days, who takes out the trash and, who runs the city hall. That's not what they're concerned with. But they want to make sure that uh, the borders of the Russian Federation are protected. And the best way to do that is to have a cordon sanitaire. There are Russian troops everywhere in the new republics. In Moldova, they're in Transnistria. In Armenia, there's 5,000 troops at Gyumri, and there's border guards. Azerbaijan has Russian peacekeepers. Kazakhstan has its Cosmodrome. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan has Russian troops. Belarus has a joint base. And in Georgia, there are now Russian troops, and have been for 20 years now, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The Russians look at these things, the goals that they establish, the short-term goals they establish, strictly through a realpolitik lens. If you ever listen to Vladimir Putin speak, he actually speaks in the same language as realist political theorists in political science. But you see it in the way they supported Armenia against Azerbaijan for many years. But then when it looked like Azerbaijan had the upper hand, they supported Azerbaijan against Armenia in the recent fighting. They seized Crimea and Donbass in 2014. They attempted to seize Kiev in 2022. But there's no better example than Georgia. Like Ukraine, Georgia was recognized by Russia within the internationally accepted borders through the Belovezh Accords, where they recognized the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Like Ukraine, after 2014, Russia introduced peacekeepers in 1992 to separate Georgia from South Ossetia. And then this one is a classic. In 1992, 1993, Russia wanted Georgia to become a member of the Commonwealth of Independent States. And Eduard Shevardnadze, former foreign minister of the USSR, did not want to come under the yoke of the Kremlin again. And he refused. And when he refused, Russia intervened in the war that was going on between Georgia and the separatist region of Abkhazia on behalf of the Abkhazian separatists. When Shevardnadze's back was up against the wall, however, he finally agreed to join the CIS. And when he did that, Russia changed sides and intervened on behalf of the central government against its former allies of Abkhazia. By August 2008, war broke out. Russia had troops in country already. They were there to protect the railroads. And of course, they invaded through the Roki Tunnel. Russia signed an agreement that was brokered by the president of France that ended that 5-day war. It withdrew its troops from Georgia, except Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and a small part of the main part of Georgia where they were going to have peacekeepers. But then what happens? Russia recognizes the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And after that, whenever Georgia says, hey, it's time for you to withdraw your troops, they say, well, we can't. They're stationed here at the request of the legitimate government of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, so you need to negotiate with them. As a result, Russia controls 18% of Georgian territory. And what does that mean? It means that Georgia, despite the fact that it's in their constitution, and despite the fact that at every meeting of NATO, NATO reaffirms its desire to see Georgia someday become a part of NATO, it can't, because under NATO rules, no country can become a member unless it controls 100% of its territory. So the Russian strategic goals have been met. They have Russian troops permanently stationed within Georgia, and the main part of Georgia under Tbilisi, is unable to join NATO. Meantime, Georgian Dream, the coalition that rules Georgia today, completely ignores the wishes of the Georgian people to become closer to the West and ignores the occupation of its territory in an effort to improve relations with the Kremlin. And this has led to a break between Tbilisi and the West. So that's the scene setter. I'll stop here and I'll take questions from Dean Peterson.
Just to look at our agenda for today, I'll ask you some questions here, but I want to make sure the audience knows, and I see a number of our students in the audience here, that we're going to be reserving the last 15 or 20 minutes for your questions. You can feel free to enter those into the chat feature, and we'll be sure to get to those in turn. Maybe, Jim, a place to start, maybe beyond the obvious of the geographic proximity between the Republic and Russia, is why do the Russians care about this part of the world?
Well, I don't think they care for the area itself. If the Georgian people disappeared tomorrow, the Russians wouldn't care. On the other hand, if the Georgian people became fabulously wealthy and successful, they wouldn't care. All they care about is being able to move that security line further away from Moscow. You know, when the countries of Eastern Europe joined NATO, the border between NATO and the Russian Federation moved east 1,000 kilometers. Well, if you're looking at it from a geopolitical viewpoint, that's a pretty serious setback. And so that's why Russia's been trying to push back, frankly, ever since Putin came to power in 1999.
You've written several books on the region and certainly on Russia. Why did you decide to write about this particular story?
So my first book on the area was Russia's Border Wars and Frozen Conflicts, in which I compared and contrasted the Russian interventions in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And then I decided that what I wanted to do was to get more in depth on each of those. So I wrote the first one, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a few years ago, knocked it out in about a year. My goal was I was going to take each of those chapters and expand them into full books. But in the intervening years, I left the hallowed halls of academia as a full-time employee and became an independent consultant, which was the right move, by the way. Anybody that gets an academic salary will understand that. But be that as it may, I no longer had as much free time as I used to have, and it took me 5 years to complete it. So by the end of the 5 years, it became a bit of an obsession. And over that 5 years, during that time, Georgia turned very definitively away from the West. And I thought that was a story that really needs to be told, because there was no real reason for it, no real need for it, except, frankly, the personal greed of one man and a coterie of people surrounding him.
Now, there were two periods of engagement, as you write about, Russia into the region, 92, 93, and then again in 2008. Can you compare and contrast those two incursions?
So in the first incursion, the Russians were basically there already because they had not yet left. Georgia had been part of the Soviet Union, so this was the old Soviet army that was sitting there. Georgia had actually negotiated with the Kremlin on how to withdraw. They had already agreed to give up bases and things like that. And at the same time, a civil war broke out. It was mainly South Ossetia at this time, and then later it was Abkhazia. These were countries. These were areas of Georgia, within the internationally recognized borders of Georgia, that had separatist tendencies. And they basically said, you know what? It was okay when we were all part of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Georgia has declared its separation from the parent. Well, we're declaring our separation as well. And when that occurred, Georgia then tried to use force to bring these regions under its sovereignty. When that happened, uh, Russia saw an opportunity to intervene and to maintain its presence as the indispensable mover in that area. When the fighting finally stopped in 1993, the international community, the United Nations, said we need a peacekeeping force. And they said, who wants to be in the peacekeeping force? And nobody raised their hand. And the
Mm.
Russians did. The Russians said, well, we'll provide peacekeepers. And then at that time, everybody congratulated Moscow. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Finally, we have a strong country that's going to provide peacekeepers. And of course, what the Russians did was they used that peacekeeping mandate to solidify its military presence in the country. Then came 2008. 2008 was honestly a mistake, but it was one that I would contend that the Russians orchestrated. And I
Mm.
say the Russians orchestrated it because even though supposedly the Georgian central government fired the first shots at Abkhazia, the Russian military was in Russia on the other side of the Roki tunnel in full force with all their engines running, waiting waiting for the word to go in. And so what happened was the Russians or the Abkhazians, I'm not sure which at this point, uh, started to attack some ethnically Georgian villages inside Abkhazia. And to stop that, the president, Mikhail Saakashvili at that time, he believed he had the support of the West, and that if he went and reasserted control over Abkhazia at that time, that the West would back him up and keep the Russians out. Well, he miscalculated. The West was not interested in supporting him against the Red Army. He went in and frankly, he got his clock cleaned. And when that was over, then there was a series of negotiations to get the Russians back into Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because at that point, they had already cut off the main road that connected Eastern Georgia from Western Georgia. I mean, they were on the verge of taking over the whole country. But they did withdraw to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Um, and that's where things have basically stood since 2008. One last comment. I'm sorry
Mm.
I'm talking so long, Pete. Um,
No.
they haven't needed it because what they did, they haven't needed military intervention after 2008. What they did is they supported an opposition political party. That opposition political party eventually, 2012, 2013, takes control of the country without firing a shot.
Right.
The Russians end up, frankly, being in charge of the government. And that's where they are today.
And that's actually, I'm glad that you took that last step because that's actually a perfect segue to where I wanted to go, which was to explore the question of what the Russian engagement in the Republic of Georgia tells us about Russian strategy, which is to say, what you've just laid out here in this last answer was we've seen the Russians using counterintelligence and intelligence. We've seen them use direct military engagement, and then we've seen them use political subterfuge. So I'm wondering, are those the general tools in the toolbox that we should expect Russia to use in places where it's looking to engage? And obviously we have the example of Ukraine where we've seen the direct military engagement, but I'm sure they've been engaged in through those other channels as well. Tell us a bit about Russian strategy.
Yeah, the Russians have not. The Russians haven't really covered themselves in glory in this. They haven't had the success that I think they'd hoped for. They have been so in Moldova, they haven't fought since like 1990, 1991, in which case they fought against the Moldovan central government to keep Transnistria separate from them. Transnistria, of course, is still part of Moldova under international law, but Moldova does not have the ability to do anything there because there are Russian troops to keep them out. But uh, they've been able to manipulate control of the Russian-speaking population there, and by extension, they've also been playing in the politics of Moldova itself. And they've had off and on, they've had success and failures. They've had pro-Moscow people as the president, and then they've lost it. But the last thing that happened was, I guess, was about 2 weeks ago. They had elections where the Russians spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the election, and the pro-Western president won re-election. So they haven't been that successful there. In Armenia, their success was, I would contend, was primarily through their control of the economy.
Mm,
Uh, Armenia is totally under the thumb of the Russians when it comes to energy. Uh, and most of the Armenian industries are owned by Russians. And yet, despite that, because the Russians turned on Armenia and did not come to their aid when Azerbaijan attacked, traditionally, Azerbaijan only attacked within a disputed territory called Nagorno-Karabakh. But in this last round of fighting, they actually attacked part of Armenia itself. And Armenia had a defense pact with Moscow, and Moscow looked the other way. So now you've got a government in Armenia that frankly is angry at the
mm,
Kremlin and is making overtures towards the West. Uh, Ukraine, of course, they've tried everything in Ukraine, and then finally, 2022, they invaded militarily and were fought to a standstill. It's interesting that in 3 years, the front line has gained several hundred meters. That's it. Several hundred meters.
yeah,
That's World War I. That's trench warfare.
yeah.
But in Georgia, they've had success. And the reason why they've had success is that the man who controls Georgia is an oligarch named Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made his millions in Moscow. He's pro-Russian. And so what's happened is over the years, until quite recently, the Georgian government constantly gave lip service to wanting to be part of the West, wanting to be part of the European Union. Uh, and at the same time, the Georgian dream solidified its hold on all the instruments of power, including the judiciary, and they used that control to become closer to Moscow. And in a sense, I can't fault them too much because not quite as bad as Armenia, but the Georgian economy is also pretty much beholden to Moscow.
Mm,
When Moscow's mad at Tbilisi, it announces that it can no longer accept Georgian imports because they don't meet the stringent Russian health codes. The what? I'm sorry. And and similarly, it starts to round up Georgian expats that are working in Russia, which is a huge source of remittances that keeps the Georgian economy afloat. So because they're so dependent, it certainly makes sense. They've tried to open up to China as well as a counterweight, but to me, what is striking, and maybe it's this philosophy that maybe the best way to solidify your hold on power is to identify an external enemy
Mm.
that you need to fight against, and they chose the West. They chose the West. They said the West is too liberal and supports and does not support family values and is opposed to everything that the Orthodox Church teaches and is out to force uh, Georgia to join the war in Ukraine against the Russians, which would only hurt Georgia.
Well, that obviously is another great transition to talk about Ukraine and what the example of Russian engagement in Georgia tells us about Ukraine and maybe even beyond. You know, it has been said on more than one occasion by President Zelensky that the Russian aspirations do not end at Ukraine, and that one of his arguments is that if 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 Putin is not stopped here, uh, this could continue to go on into other places. First, what do you think about that argument? But also, second, what does Georgia that history tell us about Ukraine?
Big question. Well, first of all, I'm probably older than 90% of the audience, so I remember Vietnam. And the United States used to argue, oh, we have to protect South Vietnam because if South Vietnam goes, they'll also fight us in Cambodia. We'll lose Cambodia, we'll lose Laos, uh, and it was called the domino theory.
Hmm.
And everybody sneered at it. Everybody sneered at it. Oh, this is what those conservatives say. It's not true, et cetera, et cetera. So, well, what happened? Saigon fell. Cambodia fell, Laos fell, they all fell. The domino theory came true. So would Vladimir Putin continue to expand? I think at a minimum, he will continue to try to increase his hold on the countries of the former Soviet Union, to the extent that those countries are willing to be satellites of Moscow, like Belarus, then everything's fine. But then if they want to show any sort of independence, uh, as Georgia did before 2012, as Ukraine does even today, uh, then there's problems. Beyond that, and this I think is troublesome, let's not forget there are the Baltic states that the Soviet Union annexed in 1945. And we never accepted the fact that they were part of the Soviet Union. But from the Kremlin's viewpoint, they were. And I'm talking about
Mm.
Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Why is this a problem? Because that's part of NATO.
Right.
So if Russia decides that it's going that we pushed in Ukraine, the West pushed as much as it was willing to, but that wasn't enough to stop us. Would they not also then try for Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania? And then what do we do? Because Article 5 comes into question.
And so, just a note as well, it's great to see questions coming in. Again, I invite questions from the audience here. You can type them into the chat feature, and we'll be sure to get to those in due course. Um, you gave an assessment of uh, Russian advances into Ukraine, but just to maybe put the question more plainly, is Russia winning in Ukraine?
Define winning. Russia has control over Crimea. It controls most of the area of Ukraine along the Sea of Azov. But since the early days of 2022, it has only advanced several hundred yards. Now, that being said, Russia has a much larger economy, much larger population, much larger army, which means that if it does become what it looks like, if it remains a static war of attrition, in the end, Russia wins. Unless the West does something to help Ukraine out, um, it just doesn't have the manpower to keep going. Russia's willing to say, what's there so far, a million
Yeah.
casualties, I believe, a
Yeah.
million casualties, and Putin doesn't even blink. Georgia can't, or Ukraine can't afford that.
Can't sustain that. Right.
Yeah.
Um, just on that note, the breaking news is that, and to bring the United States into this conversation, um, it it seems like President Trump is becoming exhausted with uh, President Putin. He's raised the specter of selling uh, Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine that would give Ukraine greater reach into Russia. What's your sense of where the president is and where what the future of American engagement in this war looks like?
I don't think the president has given up on President Putin entirely. Just today, he announced that he had had another conversation with Putin. Putin had congratulated him on the peace agreement that is taking place in Gaza. And he said, I'm going to be talking with Putin. In fact, I'm getting ready to meet him. There's a summit coming up, and I'm going to meet with Putin and try to talk to him again. So, whereas, yes, he was on the verge of actually giving Zelensky more support in order to force Putin to come to the table. I think that President Putin has once again managed to pull the president's teeth by being nice to him and saying, sure, let's have another conversation, let's talk. And that is keeping the United States out of this, other than, well, before we were giving weaponry to Ukraine, now we're selling weaponry to Ukraine. Other than that, I don't see us being involved.
What's
We
your
haven't been,
assess?
go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say we haven't really been involved in Georgia at all since 2004. Uh, uh, President Obama was not interested at all in or 2008, I guess 2008.
Right.
President Obama was not interested in Ukraine, and since then it's just sort of fallen off the map when it comes to U.S. politics.
We were just talking about your assessment of American engagement in the region. What's your sense of European involvement?
So the
Particular
Europeans,
countries that we might look for uh, to either step in or step back?
well, the Europeans are very definitely getting more and more involved in Ukraine. A day doesn't go by that I don't pick up a newspaper and read that another European country has decided to send Ukraine money, weapons, airplanes, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the big thing now is that the Europeans are starting to purchase weapons from the United States for delivery to Ukraine. In Georgia, I really have to admire President Putin, and I don't say that as meaning I like him. I
Right.
don't.
Yeah. Right. Right.
but I have to admire his skill and how he's managed to keep the United States at bay in the Ukraine. And in Georgia, in Georgia, uh, Georgia has been making sounds against Europe, making Europe the foil in all this since at least 2021. And yet the Europeans blindly continued to ignore it. The European Commission said, no, we're not going to give you a pathway to join the EU because there are these 12 items that you need to do in order to meet our requirements. Well, the Georgians completed 3. And having completed 3 and leaving 9 completely undone, um, the Europeans turned around and said, well, you know what? We're going to make you a candidate for the European Union. And they did that this Christmas. How appropriate. It was a nice Christmas present for
Yeah.
them. Uh, and once they had that, the Georgians frankly said, stick it in your eye. They still refuse to meet any of the requirements. And then they passed this foreign registration law, which is copied after a law from Russia. And in fact, the Georgians refer to it as the Russian law. Basically, what it says is any NGO that receives money from abroad, I think it's like 10%. But if you receive money from abroad, you have to register as an agent of a foreign power. And then you're going
Mm,
to be controlled as an agent of a foreign power.
mm,
This was the last straw. And the Europeans, who up until that time had been blind to the fact that Georgians were not meeting their requirements, they said, well, this goes to the heart of things. You can't be a part of Europe if you're not, if this gets passed. Well, they passed it. They passed it. And then the prime minister stood up and he said, well, honestly, we weren't prepared. We weren't ready to join the European Union anyway. So we're
mm.
postponing our application. So the Georgians canceled their application to join the European Union, even though uh, being in the West is part of the Georgian constitution. And then as things went on, this year they had elections, and the elections were rigged. Opposition couldn't really compete, and as a result of all that, the European Union has now also suspended acquisition uh, talks. So
Well,
that's where we are there.
well, why don't we, that actually is really tees up a couple of the questions that we have from the audience. And again, welcome anyone typing in your question into the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to it. But one comes from one of our MPP students, Kiara, who asked if polls show that most Georgians strongly support joining Western institutions, are there any steps that Georgia can realistically take to join? And we have obviously just talked about the EU or NATO in the next few years. If there's going to be this lid essentially put on top of democratic elections, is there any hope for uh, movement back toward the West?
As long as this governing elite is in charge, I would say no. There are demonstrations every day on the streets of Tbilisi, but it has no effect. It has no effect because these people are enriching themselves uh, through their contacts with Russia.
And that goes a bit to Stephen's question as well about mass imprisonment and other things that are happening there in the country. Um, let me ask a meta question, as the kids say. Um, why should Americans care about this region? There certainly is a lot of discussion on both the left and the right, increasingly on the right, that this is Russia's backyard, essentially. It's really, and if it's not Russia's, at least it's Europe's or Western Europe's. Why should Americans care about this region?
It's a valid question. It's a question that I have asked myself many times. Why should we care? This place is all these countries. They're on the other side of the world. Uh, and the Russians, at least in the beginning, even under Yeltsin, uh, sort of established in their minds a sphere of influence. And they told the United States at that time, we were trying to get involved at that time. And Yeltsin said basically, hey, this is our backyard. We're in charge here, and you need to keep out. And if there's any problems, we'll solve them ourselves. I would say there's two answers to that. One,
Mm,
from a liberal viewpoint, there's the question of whether or not we actually believe in in the American creed. Do we believe that all men are created equal? Do we believe that they're entitled to the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity? Do we believe that uh, we should be able to, we should be that beacon on the hill that it gives hope to the downtrodden, the oppressed?
mm,
Uh, you know, George Bush, uh, W. Bush, in his second national security strategy, basically said that if anybody that says that, oh, these people aren't ready for democracy, then these people are, they're just wrong, because they don't believe in human rights, because democracy is a human right. So if we believe the American creed, and if we believe that that American creed is a universal creed, then that's a reason to be there, to help people that are uh, trying to be free.
mm.
The more conservative answer, which is the one I, of course, lean towards, goes back to realist political theory. We live in an anarchic world order. There's no world policeman out there that is going to say to Russia, "You get a speeding ticket because you violated the rules of the road." It's not going to. There's nobody can do that, and so as a result, we have to look to our own defense. Now, how do we look to our own defense? There's two ways. One is relying on our own internal internal sources of power. Now, this administration believes that's sufficient. This administration has even toyed with the idea of pulling out of NATO, saying, we've got the largest army in the world, we've got the best fighting army in the world, we've got enough bombs in the world, we have the strongest economy in the world. Why do we need anybody else? But the other way to get power is externally uh, by lining up allies
Mm,
and adding whatever those allies can bring to the table to our own power. And while it is true that we are the strongest in all these things, um, that's in absolute terms. In relative terms, we've been losing ground. We've been losing ground to China in a big way, and we've been losing ground to Russia. We've been losing ground to Russia because Russia is willing to use the power that it has, and we're
mm,
not. So in the end, is the Atlantic and are the Atlantic and the Pacific two moats that are going to protect us? I would contend that in an era of interdependence, where we need economic allies in order for the American economy to prosper, we also need political and military allies, and that's not going to happen if countries see these dominoes falling. I'll tell you a story. In 2008, when the Russians invaded Georgia, and the United States really did nothing. We put sanctions, economic sanctions, on a couple of people, but that was all. I was talking to an ambassador from one of the countries, and he told me, he said, I got to tell you, the entire region overnight changed. Up until that time, all the countries had been leaning towards the West and saying, we really ought to be friends with the United States. Look at how successful the United States has been. We should share in that success. Let's be allies with the United States. Overnight, all of them said, you know what? We need to reassess, and we need to start to mend our fences with the Kremlin. Well, if Putin keeps pushing outward and Putin
mm.
goes into Europe and we don't do anything, what are those countries in Europe going to do? I, there's a very good case to be made based on the history of what happened in 2008 with the other countries, that they will start to mend their fences with the Kremlin as well. And that's
Hmm.
not to our benefit.
One of the things I wanted to touch on, and you do this so well in your classes, professor, but we do across the board at the policy school is discuss the importance of history as it relates to current events, to apply history in that sense. And in that, we also apply a little sociology too. And one of the things that you touched on, which I didn't want to lose, was in that history of Russia's incursions into Georgia was the concern over the distance between Moscow and its borders. And more than a few have said that there's almost, if not an actual neurosis on the part of Russian leaders as it relates to its landmass and the concerns, if not abject fears of invasion, based on history. And I wonder to what degree you feel that at the same time, you have others that are accusing Putin of saying he's really just trying to reconstitute the former Soviet empire, right? So it's empire building. And it's not to say both things can't be true. You could have both. You could have an empire builder as well as somebody acting out of fear. But I wonder how you thought about those two almost uh, psychological aspects of Putin's and broader Russian motivation.
Absolutely. Is he trying to reconstitute not the Russian Empire, but the security boundaries of the Russian Empire? Yes, absolutely he is. But what we haven't touched on, and you're now bringing up, is why? Why does he want to do this? And I would contend the answer is, uh, and we have to change our mindset a little bit. We all look at these things from the viewpoint of the West. Oh, the Russians have invaded. We have to stop them. You know, that's the Western way of thinking. From Moscow's viewpoint, from Moscow's viewpoint, every step they've taken has been defensive. It has been defensive.
Right.
Uh, you know, Russia's been invaded twice, both times from Europe. Napoleon and Hitler.
Hitler.
And then
Right.
what do? We promise the Russians, please allow Germany to be reunified, and we promise you that once that's happened, we will never put NATO troops further east than the current West Germany, East Germany border. And what did we do? We then, a couple of years later, took in basically all of Eastern Europe into NATO. Today, one of the strongest NATO militaries is Poland.
Poland.
Uh,
Right.
so they look at this, and then they look and they see Putin going to W and W explaining, oh, yes, it's true that at the Chicago meeting of NATO, we said that someday Ukraine and Georgia will be part of NATO, but don't worry about that. They're not ready for it, and we're not going to give them a membership action plan. And Putin turns to him and says, if Georgia, if you try to bring Georgia or Ukraine into NATO, they will cease to exist as a country. He said that in 2008. Is it any surprise that
Mm.
they then take over parts of Georgia in 2008 and invade Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022? Why wait? Why did it take so long? I would contend it's because uh, Russia had been building up its power, building up its strength, didn't have the ability before. I mean, that's why we were able to take in all of Eastern Europe. They didn't have the power to stop us. But then when the price of oil went up, they started to get money. They got money. They got weapons. They got weapons, and eventually they used them.
Let's go to back to the questions. We have Bailey with a question back on Georgia, asking for your thoughts on the future of Georgia politically. Do you think Russia and Georgia will ever complete a deal to remove their military presence?
No, I don't. Well, let me rephrase that. As long as this ruling coalition is in charge of Georgia, and they've taken many, many steps to make sure that they're going to be in power for a long time to come, as long as they're in power, it's just not going to happen. They don't even discuss Abkhazia and South Ossetia when they talk. They don't even discuss it. What they talk about is, oh, can we increase trade flows? Can we have visa-free travel? Can we open up border crossings? Things like that. They don't discuss the presence of these separatist groups, these separatist areas, and that means they don't talk about the Russian presence in those areas.
Somewhat related to that, I mean, do you, it, it seems as if there's no way out of Ukraine in the sense that, back to these subtitles of one of your earlier books, it's a frozen conflict, it feels
It
like.
was.
Yeah.
It was a frozen conflict. It's a hot conflict since 2022.
But frozen in its place, so to speak, even as it is, even as the missiles are flying. Um, One of the most recent steps that uh, President Zelensky and President Trump have been talking about is our security guarantees. And I wonder to what degree you think that is a viable uh, proposition. In one sense, we've just talked about the fact that history of Ukraine ever joining NATO, yet we're still talking about security guarantees. Is there a there in your mind?
There is not. And I think you just mentioned history. I think that the people that talk about security guarantees have not learned from their history. When the Soviet Union collapsed, overnight, Ukraine became the third largest nuclear power in the world. Amazing. But so many of the Soviet missiles were in Ukraine that automatically,
Yeah.
uh, Ukraine inherited them. Now, they didn't have the ability to fire them because the Kremlin wouldn't share the codes. But nonetheless, all these nuclear weapons were sitting there. We convinced Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons. And believe me, the Ukrainians were working very hard at breaking the codes so that they
Mm,
would have the ability to fire them. They had not succeeded at that point. So we signed the Bucharest Accords, in which the United States and and Russia swear that they recognize the borders of Ukraine as they existed at the fall of the Soviet Union, and that they would protect Ukraine from any military action. Russia swore it would never take military action. The United States and a couple other European countries said, we will be the guarantors of that peace. And what happened? Nothing.
mm.
Completely ignored. In fact, when in 2014, when they said when they attacked the first time, they went to the United States and said, "Hey, you guys are guarantors. Come on, what are you going to do for us?" And they said, "Well, yeah, we're guarantors, but if you read that thing, it doesn't actually say we're going to do anything." And that's where we stood from that point on. So the Russians don't care about these guarantees because they realize that the West isn't actually going to do anything. Can you imagine the current administration if we gave security guarantees, the Russians ignored it, and now we're supposed to what, put troops on the ground? It's not going to happen.
Right. Is there, if you were to be advising, and maybe you are, President Trump and his team regarding engagement with Ukraine, what would be your counsel?
Now, my counsel would be twofold, and the current administration is already doing one of it. One is to become much more involved economically with Ukraine. Make sure that that part of Ukraine that is not under Russian control recognizes that it's very much in their economic interest to stay involved with the West. Because as we saw in Georgia, when they recognized that their economic interest was with the Kremlin, then
Yeah.
that's what happened. They went with the Kremlin. So that's my first thing. My second thing would be military. Militarily, I think we do need to give the Ukrainians the weaponry that they're asking for. You know, the Ukrainians have never asked us to intervene.
Right.
They've
Yeah.
never asked us for to establish an air zone or anything like that, or put troops on the ground. All they've said is give us the weaponry and we'll do the fighting. And they have used so much innovation
Hmm.
to stalemate the Russians. I mean, I think they deserve the chance. And then the final thing is, and I do think giving them the weapons is a part of this. I think we need to go to Moscow and say, as the previous administration said, we're in this as long as it takes. And now look, now here comes the Tomahawk missiles. There's already shortages. There are now shortages on the streets of Moscow for gasoline because
Hmm.
they're blowing up so many places,
Refineries. Right.
refineries. Yeah. So you've got a million casualties. You've got shortages of gasoline. Uh, I think there are enough internal pressures building that eventually they will reach an accommodation. But as of right now, the Russians have a free hand. They know they have a free hand, and so there's nothing that they're willing to do to bring this war to an end.
As we get toward the last couple minutes, one of the questions that you um, that we haven't touched on, two countries we haven't touched on are China and North Korea. And one of the things that seems to be a little bit of a blinking red light of problem for Russia and their ability, we were talking before about their ability to sustain a war of attrition as they have, but there seems to be a little bit of a blinking red light in their dependence on seeming dependence on North Korea, whether troops or manpower. I'm hearing that they're engaged in running some of these oil refineries and doing some of the industrial work in Russia to sustain their energy industries. To what degree is that something that you think might point to some a little weakness there on their part? To what
Yeah.
degree is this something they, because of that relationship with North Korea, they can really just ride it out?
So one of the internal pressures within Russia would be the demands of the Russian population for things to stop going down this road. And in an effort to keep that from happening, uh, Putin has intentionally not drafted the Great White Russians. He has used just people from the minority populations around the Russian Federation. He's running low,
Hmm,
so he's looking for additional fodder to what they say is to send into the butcher.
hmm,
And so the North Koreans have been willing to send troops in. Problem is, the North Korean troops are worthless. And I'm not saying that to say take anything away from their bravery. They're very brave,
hmm.
but they're not trained. They're
Yeah.
not trained, and North Koreans have not fought since what 1953. And as a result, basically they just go to the front line. They get told to go forward, and then they all get killed. Uh, but that's what the North Korean thing is. It's an attempt to make sure they can continue to put pressure on Ukraine with additional troops without having to call on the Russians. So there is a weakness there
Hmm.
because eventually he may have to call them. I mean, he's already emptied out all the prisons. Uh, so and as for China, China is an interesting case because, as everybody knows, China traditionally has been a rival of Russia going back hundreds of years. Russia has thousands of tactical nuclear warheads, uh, and most of them are in Siberia. Well, what are they doing there? In Siberia, not along NATO. They're in Siberia. tactical ones that supposedly can be used on the warfield, on a battlefield. Well, the answer is they're there in case fighting breaks out with China.
Mm,
China looks at this and says, wow, as long as this is going on, the West, no matter how much they're building up their military, it's all directed at Russia, and and a lot of the military equipment is going to Ukraine, and this gives us a free hand in the East. So
mm,
we should keep this battle going. And as a result, China is giving Russia not military equipment because they don't want to really fall afoul of the Trump administration, but dual use equipment, which then
mm,
gets used in the military effort. The
mm.
other thing is you have to ask yourself, if the West finally allows Russia to win in Ukraine, Beijing's watching that the West doesn't have what it takes to stop a military incursion against an ally. Okay, what about Taiwan?
That's an
And that,
argument, right?
yep. And why do we care about Taiwan? I mean, we care about it for geopolitical reason. We also care about it because that's where we get all our chips.
Jeez. Well, I see we're at our time. Professor Coyle, thank you very much for this terrific conversation. And thanks to all of our students and audience for joining us. Because you've registered for this, you'll be getting a link to the video for this. We did record this, and we'll be posting it to the School of Public Policy's YouTube channel. When you get the link, it's a chance to share it with others in your own network who may be looking for insights into the Russian mind, its tactics and strategy, and how the Republic of Georgia and that history tells us so much about what's happening today in Ukraine. So, Professor Coyle, anything you'd like to leave us with as we conclude?
Well, I just want to say to Jeff and Mark and Danielle and all my former students that are here that I'm really happy that you checked in, and I hope we can have a chance to get together sometime. Uh, Moon Shadows no longer exists, so we
Mm,
can't have a we can't lift a glass there, but let's try to do it sometime.
great. Well, thanks so much, Jim. And thank you all. Have a great night and look forward to you getting the video soon. Thanks so much.